My son refused to pick me up after my risky surgery. So after 5 hours of risky, life-saving surgery, the first message I got from my only son wasn't, "Are you okay, Mom?" It was 7 words that shattered my world. "We can't drop everything. Just call an Uber." Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The message glowed on the screen of my phone, a cruel blue-white beacon in the dimming light of the hospital lobby. 6 o'clock in the evening, the air, thick with the smell of antiseptic and floor polish, felt unnaturally cold against my thin hospital gown. Outside the automatic glass doors, the Phoenix sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red. But in here, everything was sterile and indifferent. My world had shrunk to the squeaking wheels of this wheelchair and the crushing weight in my chest. A cheerful nurse named Brenda, bless her heart, had just finished checking my discharge papers. "All set, Margaret," she'd said, her voice echoing the practiced optimism of healthcare workers. "Your son should be pulling up any minute now." I didn't have the heart to show her the screen. I just nodded, a pathetic, weak gesture that took more effort than it should have. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the edges of the phone. I read the words again and again. "We can't drop everything." As if picking up his 65-year-old mother from the hospital after major surgery was a minor inconvenience, like stopping for milk on the way home. My son, Gregory, the boy whose fevers I'd cooled and whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, was telling me I was not a priority. Just as the full force of that betrayal began to settle in my bones, my phone buzzed again. A different notification this time. An email. The subject line was stark, official, and utterly terrifying. Summons. Ex parte guardianship hearing. My breath caught in my throat. I tapped it open, my mind struggling to make sense of the legal jargon. It was a court document, filed in Maricopa County. It stated that a hearing was scheduled in 72 hours to determine my competency and assign a temporary guardian. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Then I saw the name at the bottom of the page, next to the word petitioner. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a mistake. It was my daughter-in-law, Linda Ellison. The 2 messages converged into a single horrifying reality. They weren't just leaving me stranded. They were staging a coup. "Ready to go, Margaret?" Brenda asked, her hand already on the back of my wheelchair. She began pushing me toward the exit, toward the oppressive evening heat. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the dry desert air hit my face. I looked down at the phone in my lap. One message had abandoned me. The other was trying to legally erase me. In the span of 5 minutes, I had gone from a patient recovering from a dangerous operation to a piece of inconvenient luggage. And then, a legal problem to be managed. My son and his wife hadn't just refused to pick me up. They were systematically stripping me of my own life, starting with my freedom. The fight for my life, I realized, hadn't ended in the operating room. It had just begun. The next 3 days were a masterclass in solitude. They moved me from the post-op recovery bay to a private room on the 3rd floor, a sterile white box that quickly began to feel like a prison cell. The only sound was the rhythmic, monotonous beep of the heart monitor, a constant reminder that I was alive, but not exactly living. Each beep felt like a second ticking away, a second my son and his wife couldn't spare. My meals arrived on a plastic tray, always covered with a lukewarm plastic dome. I'd pick at the gelatin or the mashed potatoes, but my appetite had vanished, replaced by a hollow ache that had nothing to do with the incision in my abdomen. The food would sit there, growing cold, a perfect metaphor for the hope I'd harbored. I kept replaying Linda's last phone call, from the day before my surgery, Her voice had been dripping with concern, thick as honey. "Don't you worry about a thing, Margaret," she'd cooed. "We'll be there as soon as you're out of recovery. I'll bring your favorite chamomile tea and that cozy blanket you love. We'll get you settled back at home in no time. You can count on us." "You can count on us." The words echoed in the deafening silence of the room. In the beginning, I believed her. For the first 24 hours, I made excuses for them. Gregory was probably swamped at work. Linda had the kids to look after. It was a long drive from their suburban paradise. I told myself they were just giving me space to rest. But as the second day bled into the third, the excuses wore thin, turning brittle and transparent. No calls, no texts, nothing. The hope I'd clung to curdled into a bitter, lonely resignation. It was clear I wasn't on their to-do list at all. That was the last straw. On the third afternoon, a hospital administrator came by with a clipboard and a folder full of paperwork. She was efficient and detached, running through a checklist of insurance forms and billing codes. "Just a few things to sign here, Mrs. Ellison," she said, her pen tapping impatiently. As I scrawled my shaky signature across the pages, a loose sheet of paper slipped from her folder and fluttered onto my bedside table. "Oh, whoops," she said, not bothering to pick it up. "That must be from your son's file. You can just toss it." She gathered her things and left before I could respond. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached for the paper. It wasn't a doctor's note or a prescription. It was an invoice. The letterhead was professionally printed in a calm, soothing blue. Harborcrest Care LLC. Beneath the name, a slogan read, "Providing compassionate in-home support." My eyes scanned the details. It was a bill for comprehensive geriatric care and wellness monitoring, addressed to Gregory and Linda Ellison, but for services rendered to Margaret Ellison. The amount listed at the bottom made my breath catch. $8,000. For what? I hadn't received any in-home support. I was right here in this hospital bed. I folded the paper, my fingers tracing the crisp edges. Harborcrest Care. The name was unfamiliar, yet it felt sinister. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a stray document. It was a piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was supposed to be solving. Linda's sweet promises, Gregory's cold text message, the sudden guardianship hearing, and now this phantom bill for $8,000. They weren't separate events. They were connected. My son and his wife weren't just neglecting me. They were building something, a careful, calculated trap. And this invoice was the first brick I'd found. The loneliness in my heart was suddenly joined by something else, something cold and sharp, suspicion. They were digging their own grave, and they just handed me the shovel. After 3 days in limbo, the hospital finally discharged me. A different nurse, a young man with kind eyes, wheeled me out through the same automatic doors I'd been staring at for 72 hours. The blast of late afternoon heat was like a physical blow. The Phoenix air was a furnace, dry and suffocating, and the sun, hanging low in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the concrete. I felt small and exposed under the vast, unforgiving sky. My worldly possessions were in a plastic bag on my lap. A cheap paperback, my wallet, and the phone that had become a source of dread. I had arranged for a taxi, a concession to the fact that no one else was coming. It was supposed to arrive in 10 minutes. 10 minutes to sit here. A spectacle of vulnerability at the hospital entrance. Cars came and went in a steady stream. Families welcoming new mothers, relieved spouses picking up their partners. Each happy reunion was a small twist of the knife. I focused on a pair of saguaro cacti in the landscaped median, their spiny arms raised to the sky as if in surrender. I knew the feeling. That's when I saw him. He wasn't a doctor or a visitor. He wore a simple gray suit, the kind that doesn't draw attention, but he moved with a quiet purpose that set him apart from the chaos of the hospital exit. He was older, probably close to my age, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had seen its share of trouble. He walked directly toward me, his gaze unwavering. My first instinct was fear. Was this man connected to the guardianship hearing? Had Linda sent someone? I clutched the plastic bag tighter. He stopped a respectable few feet away. His expression wasn't threatening. It was heavy, weighed down. "Mrs. Margaret Ellison?" he asked. His voice was calm, a low baritone that carried easily over the traffic noise. I just nodded, unable to find my voice. "My name is Richard Callahan," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm a manager at the regional bank. I'm sorry to approach you like this, especially now, but we need to talk." The bank? My mind raced. I had a small savings account, my late husband's pension. Nothing that would warrant a personal visit from a manager. I don't understand," I stammered. He took a half step closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't about your accounts, Mrs. Ellison. It's about a loan, a mortgage application to be precise." He paused, letting the words sink in. The air between us felt thick with unspoken meaning. "Your son, Gregory, has been in negotiations with us. Things have gotten complicated. It's a real can of worms." I stared at him, bewildered. Gregory had his own house, his own mortgage. What did that have to do with me? Richard seemed to read the confusion on my face. His own was etched with a deep professional regret. He looked at the hospital behind me, then back at my face, and seemed to make a decision. He delivered the final blow with the grim finality of a judge passing sentence. "We need to talk, because your name is on the paperwork," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "He listed you as a co-borrower, and based on the documents he submitted, you're not just a party to this. Mrs. Ellison, you're the one who's been implicated." The world tilted on its axis. The setting sun had turned the sky a deep, bruised crimson, the color of an old wound. It bled across the horizon, a perfect, terrible omen for the storm that had just broken over my head. Richard canceled my taxi with a quick, discreet phone call. "Let's go somewhere private," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We can't have this conversation out in the open." He helped me from the wheelchair into the passenger seat of his sensible, dark blue sedan. The leather was cool against my skin despite the evening heat. The car was immaculate, organized, and smelled faintly of mints. It felt like a different world from the sterile chaos of the hospital. He drove in silence, his hand steady on the wheel. He didn't head for the freeway, but instead navigated a series of quiet residential streets until we pulled into a small, deserted park. A few lonely mesquite trees dotted a patch of brown grass. He parked the car under the shade of the largest one and killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Richard turned in his seat to face me. His expression grim, he reached into the back and retrieved a slim leather briefcase. "Mrs. Ellison," he began, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Your son is in deep trouble, and he's trying to drag you down with him." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder. From it, he produced a single sheet of paper. It was a simple flowchart, neatly printed. There were 3 boxes connected by arrows. The first box said, "Margaret Ellison's retirement savings." An arrow pointed to the second box, labeled "Medical and Care Expenses." And from there, a final arrow pointed to the third box, "Harbor Crest Care LLC." My own invoice, the one I'd found in the hospital. My heart began to pound. "We started looking into Harbor Crest after your son submitted several large withdrawal requests to cover their invoices," Richard explained. his voice low and even. On the surface, it looks legitimate. But it's a shell corporation, Margaret. It was registered just 2 months ago. The address is a P.O. box, and the sole proprietor is one Linda Ellison. The air left my lungs in a rush. It was all true. The fake concern, the promises, the $8,000 bill. It was a scheme. They were bleeding me dry under the guise of caring for me. The sense of betrayal was so profound it felt like a physical illness, a nausea that rose from my stomach to my throat. But how could he? I have to approve any large withdrawals, I whispered, my voice hoarse. That's the other thing, Richard said, his face hardening. He pulled another document from the folder and handed it to me. It was a photocopy of a durable power of attorney. My name was at the top. Gregory's was listed as my agent. And at the bottom, next to a smudged and barely legible notary seal, was a signature. It was a clumsy, shaky imitation of my own, a forgery. He filed this with the county clerk's office last week, Richard said quietly. He's trying to get the whole 9 yards, complete control over your finances, your property, your medical decisions. He's not just taking your money, Margaret. He's trying to take your life. I stared at the forged signature, at the blurry seal. This piece of paper was a declaration of war. My son, my own flesh and blood, had conspired with his wife to strip me of everything I had, to render me powerless while I was at my most vulnerable. The shock was a tidal wave, pulling me under. But as the cold, dark water of that reality closed over my head, something else ignited within me, a tiny, flickering ember of rage. It was a cold, hard flame in the pit of my stomach. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They thought I would just lie down and let this happen. They were dead wrong. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The car was an island of silence in the fading light of the park. The forged power of attorney lay on the dashboard between us, a toxic testament to my son's betrayal. I felt hollowed out, the initial shock giving way to a cold, brittle numbness. I stared out the window at the deepening shadows, trying to process the sheer scale of the deception. Richard let the silence hang in the air, giving me space to breathe. He wasn't pushing or prodding, he just waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, stripped of the banker's professional edge. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said. "No one should have to go through this, especially not with their own family." I just shook my head, unable to form words. He was quiet for another moment. Then he asked a question that seemed to come from a different world entirely. "Your maiden name," he said, his voice hesitant. "Was it Sullivan?" The question was so unexpected it pierced through my haze of shock. I turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time. The silver hair, the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, a ghost of a memory, 45 years old, flickered in the back of my mind. A boy with the same serious eyes, standing on a porch swing. "Yes," I whispered. "How did you know that?" A slow, sad smile touched his lips. "Maggie Sullivan from North Phoenix High. The girl who loved poetry and always had a book in her hand." The breath hitched in my throat. No one had called me Maggie in decades. "Ricky Callahan?" I said, the name feeling foreign and yet intimately familiar on my tongue. "The boy who was going to be a baseball star?" "The one with the bad knee," he confirmed, a flicker of the old boyish charm in his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned. After all these years." It was impossible. The world had just been torn apart, and now a ghost from the past was sitting right next to me. We stared at each other, two strangers who knew each other's deepest teenage secrets. The years melted away, and for a heartbeat, I wasn't a 65-year-old widow in trouble. I was 17 again, and he was the boy who'd promised to write. You never did, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. You went off to college and never wrote. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a shadow of old pain. That's not true, Maggie. I wrote every week for 6 months. You never answered. Your mother finally wrote me back and said you'd met someone else, that you were engaged. She told me to stop bothering you. My mother? Of course. She'd never approved of him, the boy from the wrong side of the tracks. She'd wanted someone more stable for me. A lie. Our entire future had been severed by a single, cruel lie. All that heartbreak, all that time. It was all water under the bridge, but the bridge had been blown up by my own family. The emotion of it all. The betrayal from my son. The rediscovered loss from my past was too much. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. Richard's expression softened. Hey, it's okay. That was a lifetime ago. But then his gaze faltered and he looked away, out at the darkening park. Look, Maggie, I have to be honest with you. This isn't a complete coincidence. I saw your name on the loan application last week. I recognized it, and I hesitated. What do you mean? This is a messy situation for the bank, he admitted, his voice low and strained. My bosses, they just wanted to go away. The easiest path for us would be to approve the loan based on Gregory's fraudulent paperwork and foreclose when he defaults. It's clean, legally. When I realized who you were, I knew I couldn't let that happen. But for a few days, I almost did. I almost put the bank first. His confession hung in the air, a complicated, ugly truth. He wasn't a knight in shining armor who had appeared out of nowhere. He was a man who had been faced with a choice, and he had almost made the wrong one. The rekindled spark of hope was now tinged with the gray reality of the world we lived in. But he had made the right choice in the end. He had come to find me, and in the wreckage of my life, that was more than enough. The next morning, Richard picked me up from the modest motel room he'd arranged for me. My own home was no longer a safe place. Are you ready for this? He asked, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He's not going to back down without a fight. He's the one who should be worried, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The ember of rage from the day before had been stoked into a slow, burning fire. Let's go. We walked into the bank's main branch just before 10 o'clock. The air was cool and smelled of money and ambition. Richard led me past the line of tellers to a hallway lined with glass-walled offices. In the third one, I saw him. My son, Gregory. He was sitting across a large mahogany desk from a man in a suit, a loan officer by the name of Mr. Davies, according to the plaque on his desk. Gregory was in the middle of a performance. His shoulders were slumped, his face a mask of weary concern. He was gesturing with his hands, explaining something with feigned earnestness. He looked like the model of a devoted son, burdened by his mother's failing health. The sight of it made my blood run cold. Richard held the door for me. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. Gregory, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. He froze, his hand hovering midair. His head snapped toward me. The color drained from his face, leaving a pasty, sickly white. He looked like a child who'd been caught red-handed with his hand in the cookie jar. Mr. Davies, the loan officer, looked back and forth between us, his brow furrowed in confusion. Mom, Gregory stammered, scrambling to his feet. What are you doing here? You should be resting. I've had enough rest, I said, taking another step into the room. Richard stood behind me, a silent, solid presence. I'm sorry to interrupt, I said, looking directly at Mr. Davies. But I overheard my name. I believe my son was just telling you about my dementia. I'd love to hear more about it." The silence in the room was absolute. Mr. Davies's pen, which had been poised over a document, remained perfectly still. Gregory's shock quickly morphed into something else: panicked, cornered rage. His nice guy facade crumbled, revealing the desperate man underneath. "You see?" he said, his voice rising, turning to Mr. Davies. "This is exactly what I was talking about. She's confused. She wanders off. She doesn't know what's good for her." He was doubling down. I had expected it, but the audacity of it still took my breath away. He snatched his briefcase from the floor, fumbling with the latches. He pulled out a sheaf of papers and slammed them onto the desk. "Here," he said, shoving them toward the loan officer. "This is the durable power of attorney she signed. It gives me the authority to handle her affairs." He wasn't finished. He produced another document. "And this," he announced, his voice ringing with false authority, "is a summons for an emergency guardianship hearing. The court is already involved because she's a danger to herself. I'm just trying to protect her. I'm trying to do the right thing here." Mr. Davies looked down at the forged POA, then at the court summons, then back at me. His professional, neutral expression was now clouded with doubt. In his eyes, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a problem, an old, confused woman being managed by her long-suffering son. Gregory had taken my ambush and turned it against me, using his lies as his shield and his sword. For a terrible, sinking moment, it looked like he was winning. The courtroom was small, paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all the light and hope from the room. It smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I sat at a long table with Richard on one side and a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer he'd hired, Miss Davies, on the other. Across the aisle, Gregory and Linda sat with their own lawyer, looking smug and confident. Linda even had the audacity to give me a look of pity, a carefully rehearsed performance for the judge. They thought this was a slam dunk. The man presiding, Judge Harold Cole, was a formidable figure. He looked to be in his late 70s, with a fringe of white hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Gregory's lawyer spin a tale of my supposed decline, my confusion, my forgetfulness, my inability to manage my own affairs. It was a masterpiece of fiction. I felt a surge of helpless anger as he painted me as a doddering old fool. Then it was our turn. Ms. Davies called our first witness, Dr. Priya Nandakumar, a respected geriatric specialist. She was poised and professional. Instead of just giving a report, she turned to the judge. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to ask Mrs. Ellison a few questions." Judge Cole nodded. Dr. Nandakumar turned to me. "Margaret," she said kindly, "can you please tell the court today's date?" "It's August 22nd, a Friday," I said, my voice clear. "And who is the current president of the United States?" I answered. "Can you count backward from 100 by sevens?" 100, I began. 93, 86, 79. I continued all the way down to 2 without a single hesitation. Dr. Nandakumar turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, Mrs. Ellison is not only cognitively sound, she is exceptionally sharp. There is absolutely no medical basis for a guardianship petition. In my professional opinion, this filing is completely without merit." Gregory's jaw tightened. Linda's pity-filled expression flickered. Next, Ms. Davies called Officer Lila Chen from Adult Protective Services. She was all business. She presented a preliminary report, her voice flat and official. "We've identified several red flags in this case," she stated, looking at her notes. "Significant, unexplained financial transactions, the recent and questionable filing of a power of attorney, and the subject's isolation from her usual social contacts. These elements are highly consistent with a pattern of elder financial abuse. The word abuse hung in the air. Gregory sank a little lower in his chair. Finally, Richard's young analyst, Alina Reyes, was called to the stand. She was nervous but composed. She presented a single document, the official business registration for a company called Harbor Crest Care LLC. "As you can see, Your Honor," Alina said, her voice gaining confidence, "the company was formed 2 months ago. The sole owner and proprietor is listed right here." She pointed to a line on the document. "Linda Ellison." A collective gasp went through the small courtroom. Linda went pale, her mask of concern shattering into a million pieces. She looked at Gregory, her eyes wide with panic. They had been caught, red-handed. Judge Cole had seen enough. He held up a hand, silencing our lawyer before she could even continue. He looked down at Gregory and Linda, his eyes like chips of ice. "I have heard testimony from medical and legal authorities," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "I have seen evidence of what appears to be a blatant and predatory attempt to defraud a family member." He picked up his gavel. "The durable power of attorney is hereby suspended, pending a full investigation into its fraudulent filing. The petition for emergency guardianship is dismissed, with prejudice." He brought the gavel down. Crack. The sound was sharp, final, and the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It wasn't just the sound of a gavel. It was the sound of my prison door swinging open. It was the sound of chains breaking. In that single, sharp report, the entire dynamic shifted. I was no longer the victim. I was free. The phone started ringing at 7 o'clock the next morning, a shrill, insistent sound that cut through the quiet of my motel room. I didn't have to look at the caller ID. I knew. I let it ring 4 times before picking up. "Hello, Linda," I said, my voice perfectly even. A theatrical sob erupted from the other end of the line. "Margaret! Oh, thank God. I've been so worried. How could you do this to us?" To Gregory, I took a sip of the lukewarm coffee Richard had brought me earlier. "Do what, exactly?" "This whole court thing. You're tearing the family apart. We were just trying to help you, to make sure you were taken care of, and you turned it into this. Have you even thought about the children? About what this will do to them?" The crocodile tears were flowing freely now. She was playing the victim, a role she had clearly perfected. A week ago, her words would have sliced me to the bone, filled me with guilt and self-doubt. Now, they were just noise. I listened to her frantic, manipulative monologue, waiting for her to run out of steam. "Are you done?" I asked when she finally paused to take a breath. The question seemed to throw her off. "What?" "Margaret, I'm pouring my heart out to you. Don't you care about your grandchildren?" "Of course I do," I said calmly, "which is why this conversation is over." "You can't just hang up," she shrieked, her voice losing its sorrowful tone and taking on a sharp, panicked edge. "You don't understand what's at stake here. You have to call this off. Don't push your luck." Richard, who had been sitting quietly in the chair opposite me, caught my eye and gave a slight nod. He opened his laptop, which was sitting on the small table between us, and turned the screen toward me. He clicked play. It was a video, crisp and clear, taken from a low angle. I recognized the front porch of Gregory and Linda's house. Their little girl Emma was standing there, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Linda was kneeling in front of her, her back to the camera. Her voice, captured perfectly by the doorbell's microphone, was sickly sweet. "Okay, sweetie," Linda was cooing. "If the man from the court asks you about Grandma, what are you going to say?" Emma looked down at her shoes. That Grandma is nice?" "No, honey. Remember what we practiced," Linda said, her voice still sweet, but with an undercurrent of steel. "You say, Grandma gets confused sometimes. Can you say that for Mommy? Say, she forgets things and sometimes she gets lost." The video played on. The little girl on the screen repeated the lies, her voice small and uncertain. It was the most cold-blooded thing I had ever witnessed. I looked up from the screen, my gaze unfocused, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Linda was still babbling on the phone, a torrent of threats and pleas. I held the phone back up to my ear, my hand steady. "Linda," I said, cutting her off mid-sentence. My voice was quiet, but it was harder and colder than any sound she had ever heard from me. "I just watched a video of you teaching my granddaughter how to lie." The silence on the other end was absolute. "Don't you ever," I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "use those children as a shield for your own greed. The games are over." I hung up the phone before she could respond, the click of the disconnect echoing in the silent room. We didn't give them a warning. We simply showed up. Late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn of my son's oversized stucco house. It was the house I was apparently co-borrowing for, the monument to his fragile ego. I walked up the stone pathway flanked by Richard and, for legal gravitas, Judge Cole himself, who had graciously agreed to come as a private citizen. Linda opened the door, her face a mess of shock and fear. Gregory appeared behind her, looking haggard and defeated. They had been backed into a corner, and they knew it. "We need to talk," I said, walking past them into the cavernous foyer. We sat in their formal living room, a space so pristine it looked like no one had ever actually lived in it. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I placed a document on the polished coffee table between us. "This," I said, my voice calm and measured, "is a lease agreement." Gregory stared at it as if it were a snake. "A what?" "I've spoken with the bank," I explained. "I'm going to assume the mortgage payments to prevent foreclosure. The house is, after all, 50% mine according to your own fraudulent paperwork. But you will no longer be owners. You will be tenants. You will pay me rent, on time, every month. This is the new reality." Linda let out a choked sob. Gregory just stared, his face ashen. He was trapped. If he refused, the bank would foreclose, his financial ruin would be public, and he'd still be on the hook for the debt. This was his only way out, a humiliating lifeline I was offering. "It's a raw deal, son," Judge Cole added, his voice dry as the desert air. "But it's the only deal on the table." Defeated, Gregory reached for the pen I'd placed next to the contract. His hand trembled as he uncapped it and leaned forward to sign his life away. Just then, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp and jarring. Gregory froze. A new kind of fear, raw and primal, flashed in his eyes. Linda looked at him, her expression terrified. "Don't answer it," Gregory whispered. But the person on the other side was impatient. A heavy fist began pounding on the door. "Gregory, I know you're in there. Open this door right now." With a look of utter dread, Gregory went to the door. Standing on the porch was a large, imposing man in an expensive but tasteless suit. He had the predatory stillness of a wolf who had cornered his prey. "Bennett," Gregory stammered. "Now's not a good time." The man, Bennett Rhodes, pushed past him into the foyer. "You've been dodging my calls for a week. Time's up." He stopped when he saw us in the living room, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. He quickly recovered, a smirk spreading across his face. "Having a family meeting? Perfect." He strode over to the coffee table and tossed a document down on top of my lease agreement. This might be of interest to you all. It's a lien against this property for the $200,000 your boy here owes me. As of today, this house belongs to me until I get my money back, with interest. The air in the room went ice cold. A lien, a legal claim. This was the loan shark, the wolf at the door. I felt my heart plummet. After all this, was I going to lose to this stranger? But Judge Cole simply picked up the document, his expression unreadable. He examined it closely, then handed it to Richard, who did the same. "Mr. Rhodes," the judge said, his voice deceptively mild. "This is a very impressive-looking document, but you seem to have made a small error." "I don't make errors," Bennett sneered. "Oh, but you do," Judge Cole countered, a glint in his eye. "Under Arizona Statute 33993, any lien filed must be notarized and then delivered to the property owner via certified mail before it is recorded with the county. Your notary seal is dated today, and you just hand-delivered it. You haven't recorded it yet, have you?" Bennett's smirk faltered. "I was on my way to the recorder's office." "Then this document," the judge said, tapping it with a single finger, "is legally worthless. It's a threat, not a lien, an intimidation tactic, and attempting to enforce it is a felony." He looked the man dead in the eye. "This agreement is dead in the water." Bennett Rhodes stared at the judge, then at Richard, then at me. The color drained from his face. He'd been outplayed by a retired old man. Without another word, he snatched his useless paper off the table, turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The second wave had crashed, and we were still standing. The slam of the front door echoed in the sudden, deafening silence. The immediate threat of Bennett Rhodes was gone, but the air in the living room was still thick with tension and the sour smell of fear. Gregory stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face slick with sweat. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash only to find the vehicle was now on fire. Linda was huddled on the sofa, her hands trembling in her lap. They thought the worst was over. The dust hadn't even settled. But I wasn't finished. I had let them think the house was the only battleground. It was time to show them the full extent of their miscalculation. "Sit down, Gregory," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't a request. He stumbled back to the armchair opposite me, collapsing into it. He was already on the ropes, but I wasn't about to let him off the hook. I reached into the leather portfolio Richard had brought and pulled out a second folder. I opened it and slid another document across the coffee table. It wasn't a lease agreement this time. It was a copy of a partnership filing for his independent insurance agency dated 6 months ago. "You were having some trouble with your business finances, weren't you?" I asked softly. "Your underwriters were threatening to pull your license unless you could prove you had sufficient capital reserves." Gregory stared at the paper, his eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. He knew what this was. "I remember you mentioning it," I continued, "but you told me you had found a silent partner, an investor. Funny thing is, when Richard did some digging, the only new partner on file with the state is me." I tapped a signature line on the document. "You forged my name, claiming I had invested $100,000 from my retirement fund as a capital contribution. You used my good name to commit insurance fraud, to save your own skin." This was the secret he'd been hiding, the real reason for his desperation. The house, the money from my savings. It wasn't just about greed. It was about covering up a crime that could send him to prison. Linda let out a small, strangled gasp. "Gregory, what is she talking about?" "Oh, he knows what I'm talking about," I said, turning my gaze to her. The last piece of the puzzle was about to click into place. And you know what I'm talking about too, don't you, Linda? You were the architect of the other plan, the one to drain my accounts to pay for your lifestyle while making me look incompetent. I looked from her to Gregory and back again. I have to admit, the two of you make quite a team. He forges my name to save his business, and you create a fake home care company to bill me for services I never received. I leaned forward, my voice dropping. Tell me, Linda, does Gregory know that Harbor Crest Care LLC was your personal slush fund? That was it, the final blow. The connection of both their crimes laid bare on the coffee table between them. Linda came completely unglued. The facade of the sophisticated suburban wife cracked and fell away, revealing the frantic, cornered schemer beneath. No, she shrieked, jumping to her feet. It wasn't like that. He made me do it. It was all his idea. Gregory looked at his wife, his expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. Whether he knew about her company or not, her attempt to throw him under the bus was the final straw. The fight went out of him completely. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just broke. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, his body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man, crushed under the weight of his own deceit. The room, which had moments before been a battlefield of high-stakes negotiation, felt like it had been ripped open, exposing the rotten foundation of their entire lives. They hadn't just been defeated. They had been utterly and completely dismantled. A week passed. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a strange and quiet calm. I had moved into a small, clean apartment with a balcony that overlooked a courtyard filled with bougainvillea. It was a fraction of the size of the house I'd shared with my late husband, but every inch of it was mine. There were no ghosts here, no lingering shadows of betrayal. It was a place to breathe. I was watering a newly potted geranium when there was a soft knock on the door. It was Gregory. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, diminished. The arrogant confidence he wore like a suit of armor was gone, replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion. He was holding a single envelope in his hand. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet. I stepped aside and let him pass. He stood awkwardly in the middle of my small living room, looking out of place. He didn't try to hug me or make small talk. He just held out the envelope. "Here," he said. "It's a cashier's check for $67,000. It's what's left from the Harbor Crest account and some of my own savings." I took the envelope but didn't open it. I just waited. He took a shaky breath. "I sold the agency, Mom. The deal closed yesterday. I took the first offer I got." He looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my eyes. "And I went to the state insurance board. I told them everything about the fraudulent partnership agreement, about the capital reserves. I gave them a full confession." He finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes, not the self-pity I'd seen before. "I'm going to lose my license. They'll probably fine me, maybe worse, but it's done. I'm not running anymore." He stood there, waiting for my response, waiting for absolution, perhaps, for me to say it was all right, that we could go back to the way things were. But that woman, the one who would have rushed to comfort him, who would have smoothed things over to keep the peace, was gone. "The lease on the house stays," I said, my voice cool and clear. "That doesn't change." He flinched, but he nodded. "I know, I understand." "This isn't about the money, Gregory," I continued, placing the check on the table. "It was never just about the money. It's about respect. It's about character. You and Linda, you have to learn how to live decently. You have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet without using other people as stepping stones." He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He just stood there and took it. The fight was gone. All that was left was a man forced to face the music of his own making. "I want to make it right," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I will. I'll pay the rent. I'll do whatever you say. I want to start over. I want to try to be better." It was a plea, raw and desperate, a fragile glimmer of hope in the wreckage he had created. But hope was not enough. Actions were all that mattered now. "Then start," I said. "Start by paying your rent on time." He gave a final, slow nod. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumped in a posture of complete surrender. For a long moment, he just stood there, a 42-year-old man who looked like a lost little boy, bowing his head before the mother he had tried to erase. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of my new life, leaving the door open behind him. 6 months later, the aroma of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled my small apartment. It was Thanksgiving, and the space was crowded with life and laughter. Outside, the Phoenix sun was warm, but inside, there was a coziness that had nothing to do with the temperature. The house, my house, now legally and unequivocally, was being rented by a young family who paid their bills on time. Gregory and Linda were paying their own rent in a much smaller townhouse across town. The checks arrived on the 1st of every month without fail. They were here today, helping in the kitchen. There was a quiet diligence to their movements, a noticeable lack of their old entitlement. They were guests in my life now, and they knew it. Richard was sitting on the floor, deep in a game of checkers with my granddaughter Emma. He'd become a fixture in my life, a steady, comforting presence that felt both new and wonderfully familiar. He'd wink at me over the top of Emma's head, and I'd feel a warmth that had been absent for far too long. On the counter, a beautiful bouquet of autumn flowers sat in a vase, a Thanksgiving gift from Alina, the young analyst from the bank, with a card that simply said, "To the strongest woman I know." After dinner, as we sat with coffee and pumpkin pie, I cleared my throat. The room fell quiet. "I have something I'd like to share with all of you," I began. I looked at Gregory and Linda, whose faces tensed slightly. "I've spent the last few weeks working with my lawyer to finalize my estate. I've created a living trust." I let that sink in. "The house and all my remaining assets will be placed into this trust. Upon my passing, the trust will be used to create an educational fund for Emma and Noah. It will pay for their college, their graduate school, whatever path they choose, so they can start their lives without the burden of debt." I looked directly at my son. "As for you and Linda," I said, my voice even, "you will not inherit anything directly. However, I've included a provision." I paused, making sure I had their complete attention. "The trust will be managed by an independent trustee for a period of 24 months after I'm gone. During that time, if you have remained financially responsible, have stayed out of legal trouble, and have demonstrated a consistent commitment to your children's well-being, the trustee is authorized to grant you a modest inheritance. It's not a guarantee. It's a chance, a 2-year period to prove you've truly changed your ways." It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. It was a path forward, paved with accountability. It was the last brick I needed to lay to secure my own peace of mind. Later that evening, after everyone had left and the apartment was quiet again, I stood on my balcony, looking at the stars. Richard came and stood beside me, taking my hand. The sounds of the city were a distant hum. I was safe. I was in control. I was free. I thought about the woman in the wheelchair 6 months ago, abandoned and terrified. She seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. My son's betrayal had been a cruel and devastating blow, but it had also been a gift. It had forced me to find a strength I never knew I had. I looked at the happy, peaceful home I had created for myself. At the end of the day, I hadn't just gotten my money back. I had gotten myself back, and I finally understood. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't about getting even. It's about reclaiming your own worth. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.